meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody. We're back with our weekly or semi-weekly chat with author Kevin McAleer on all kinds of literature, mostly the stuff he likes, but there might be some stuff that isn't so great as well, and we dive into these works so we find out our various opinions on them. What we've been doing as of late is we've been covering a lot of the great LA writers. Now, in looking at this list, Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Charles Bukowski, John Fante, Nathaniel West, and now this week, Bud Schulberg. I realize, and Kevin's mentioned this on various occasions, that these writers often were not born in Los Angeles, probably usually not. And so I think we have to come up with a new term for these writers, which I would call them transplanted LA writers. Now, Kevin himself is an LA writer because he was born and raised in LA and spent most of his life, most of his younger years there, until moving to Germany in his adult years. And so he can lay claim to being an LA writer, but I don't know if
and again, fourth generation. So it's not only that none of those guys in the list were born there, but I'm the fourth generation. I hate to keep harping on that, but it's an interesting difference, I should think.
Well, your whole latest book is based on that premise that it's called LA Kid, to show that, hey, he was there from his birth and his childhood and his young adult and some of his adult years. But let me ask you this question. Can you still be considered an LA writer, or would you now be considered an expatriate LA writer because you're now in Germany for the last 30 years or so? Does that still qualify you as an LA writer?
Yeah, because you're formed by the time you're 18. Okay. That's what I discovered, if nothing else, in this LA Kid that I wrote. I realized how I'm the same guy in essential respects to who I was 18, 16, 14, 12. You can go back even further, but it's those formative years that I think define you as being from one place or another. And I carry LA, the LA I describe in LA Kid, around with me in my head, in my heart, to this very day. That's the LA I identify with. That's why I almost never go back to LA. It's not my LA anymore. But I'm an LA writer, if anyone is. But I would argue that all these fellows, and particularly Mr. Schulberg, they are LA writers. For example, he came to Los Angeles with his father, B.P. Schulberg, who was head of Paramount Studios from 1926 to 1932, a real big wheel in Hollywood, B.P. Schulberg. And he can lay greater claim to being an LA writer than I am, because I always say that the Hollywood novel is the LA novel writ large, and he grew up in the belly of the beast.
Okay.
So,
let us now say that the novel we're going to cover is called "What Makes Sammy Run." So before we get into that. And that's a Hollywood novel, which last week Kevin and I said every Hollywood novel is also an LA novel. Before we get into that, so you don't think I need to create a new category called a transplanted LA writer in the case of Chandler, Cain, Bukowski, Fante, and Nathaniel West? We could just call them LA writers, or do we need to use the term transplanted LA writers just to be more accurate?
No, they're LA writers. They write about LA. They write about it well, at very least. Some write about it exquisitely, like my boy Chandler. And Chandler was born in the Midwest, and he spent his youth in England. But I don't think there's anyone who got LA better than Chandler. I really don't. I have not encountered them. I don't read current literature, so you got to stop. We'll be reading next week Bret Easton Ellis's Lesson Zero, which I think was in the 1980s it was published. And that's where I stopped. So apologies to all you writers out there who've been writing about LA in the past 30 years or so. I'm not giving you any cred here, but I think for my money, the guy I like most is Chandler.
No.
So if you write well about Los Angeles and you've lived there a fair amount of time, even if you haven't grown up there, then I would argue you're an LA writer. Yeah.
Okay. So I won't use the term transplanted LA writer for anybody. You've already defined what makes an LA writer quite well.
Well,
Okay.
it depends. You got to look at each individual case. I would not call Nathaniel West an LA writer. The guy was a total New Yorker.
Okay.
Or East Coaster, and he came to LA and looked at it with a very jaundiced eye, as did Chandler, as did Kane. You know, I'm not nothing against that, but I really can't identify with his zombie apocalypse vision of LA because I don't think that's what LA is about. So I would discount him from that designation as being an LA writer. He wrote most of his novels are not about LA.
Okay, but Kevin, do you think that my terminology of transplanted LA writer makes sense for some people, or should I just nix it?
Yeah, sure. He wrote a great novel or two, however many, about LA. He lived in LA in his middle to late years, but yeah, you got to qualify it.
Okay, got it.
You got to grow up there. Bukowski is an LA writer. He spent his first 2.5 years in Germany, but you're barely conscious at that point. So even if he wasn't born in LA, he's a complete LA writer. And there's almost no writer, for my money, that is more closely associated with the city than Bukowski.
Okay. So there's various factors.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. It's not just, hey, I was born in LA and I write, so I'm an LA writer. There's other aspects.
No. You can either not be born in LA and grow up there and then write about LA or not, or you can be born elsewhere, then come to LA in your younger years and write about LA. You can come to LA in your middle years and write about LA. All those qualify as LA writers.
Okay.
I would argue.
Okay, that's good. And you said your favorite writer for LA is, in describing LA, is Raymond Chandler. So I would like to say, do you think the best depiction of Hollywood of a Hollywood novel is or given by Bud Schulberg in What Makes Sammy Run? Is that the best Hollywood writing you know about?
Absolutely. It's my number one Hollywood novel, even beyond Chandler's effort in Little Sister. Yeah, this is the Hollywood novel. For one reason, it meets that first prerequisite. All the main characters are from elsewhere, mostly the East Coast. And it meets the other second requirement. Actually, that was a requirement I had for an LA novel, right? Everyone being from elsewhere. But that's also good for Hollywood, okay?
That works for the Hollywood novel. Yeah.
It works for the Hollywood, yeah. I mean, almost everyone in Hollywood in the early years was from somewhere else, just by virtue of the fact that it was such a young industry. And it started on the East Coast, so, there it is. And the other factor is that Hollywood is all about hype, and that's LA. It was all about hype in its early years. I talked about that the last podcast, that the city fathers, the Chamber of Commerce, they were experts at civic boosterism because they had all this land that they wanted to populate, and they wanted sell all this real estate, and so they were hyping the city, hyping it and hyping it and hyping it. And if you had to find one word to describe Hollywood, it's hype, right? So again, my grand thesis that a Hollywood story and an LA story go hand in hand if they're good, if they're written well. So those are two qualifications. Everyone from somewhere else, it's all about hype. Yeah, take it from there.
All right, so tell us some of the detail about What Makes Sammy Run. Can you give us a brief description of the plot?
This will be very brief because it's a fairly long novel in comparison to those we've been reading. In my version, it's about 270 pages. And
can I see your version? I want to see what it looks like. Cover. Hey, we're on the same page.
Yeah, we are on the same page indeed. And with a foreword by Bud Schulberg, which I'm sure you read.
An afterword by him too.
Yeah, after we're talking about the two short stories
that are also included.
Whence the novel emanated.
Yep.
And yeah, it's a good addition. It's about a guy named Sammy Glick. Originally Glickstein, right? A Jewish kid from the Lower East Side, New York, born about 1910 or so, right? The action takes place in the late 20s. It kicks off in the late 20s. And he gets a job as an errand boy, basically a gopher at this New York newspaper where this fellow named Al Mannheim works. And Mannheim's several years older. I don't know how much older exactly, but a good 5, 6, 7, it seems. He's established himself on the paper. And Sammy starts to fascinate him because Sammy's always running in a real and a figurative sense. If his feet aren't running, and his mind's always racing. And what's it racing toward? Success. Success with the first S a dollar sign and the last two S's dollar signs too. Success in that proud American tradition of making money to aggrandize yourself with material wealth and prestige. Okay? And Sammy's after this. Okay? We don't find out why Sammy's running, what makes Sammy run, right? We find this out later. Al's guessing about it the whole time, but what makes this kid, this scrawny, in his teen years, scrawny little kid just racing and scheming and conniving because he wants to get ahead. He wants to get ahead. What's driving this guy? And that's basically the dynamic of the story. It's Al and Sammy's rise to the top eventually in Hollywood, and Al's observations along the way and his gauging of his success and his evaluations of what makes Sammy run till we finally discover what exactly it is. We can get to that a bit later. But I just say this, I think you will have picked up on this. There is a very Gatsby-esque structure or a constellation of characters to this novel. You have this kid who starts from nothing, Sammy Glick. He chops off the Stein, right? A lot of Jews did that. We saw that with Nathan.
Nathan Weinstein.
Weinstein, yeah, we saw it last time with Nathaniel West. He was Nathan Weinstein. Well, this again, Sammy chops off the Stein, the attempt to assimilate, right? Sammy Glick, and he is a Gatsby-esque character. I mean, Gatsby is very Glickian. I mean, he really is. He's in a hurry. He wants material success. He wants riches and wealth and prestige, and he's willing to do anything to get it, right? Gatsby is. He's willing to become involved with mobsters and become a bootlegger. Dangerous stuff, but he's willing because he will pay any price for that American dream. And this is also about the American dream. And to quote Fitzgerald, if I get it right, the foul dust that floated in the wake of that dream. Okay? This is very Gatsby-esque. From Sammy Glick as being this Gatsby-like character to Al Mannheim, who's sort of the outside observer, seeing his life, eventually delving into his past, about 2/3 into the novel, which is exactly where we get it with Gatsby. Maybe about 3/5, 2/3. And of course, we have this other character Her name is Catherine Sargent. Her nickname is Kit. Catherine Kit Sargent. And she's like Jordan Baker. She's even described that way. This sort of mannish body. She walks like she's on a golf course. Jordan Baker herself is a professional golfer. And they form a trio, Kit, Sammy, and Al. Kit, at a certain point, is Sammy's lover, right? But they're not in love. Kit again eventually gets together with Al, right? The Nick character, as does Jordan Baker. And you have Al and Kit always consulting with another as to Sammy. They're both fascinated by him. What makes this guy tick? What is the mainspring behind this guy and all the dirty tricks and backstabbing that he undertakes just to get ahead? And this is the same thing with Jordan Baker and Nick Carraway. They discuss Gatsby, and all this sort of thing. So that's interesting, and it also ends in a Gatsby-esque way.
It's also, I'd like to add, the narrative perspective is the same. You have Nick Carraway, the closest friend, trying to analyze and figure out Gatsby, and here you have Al Mannheim, the closest friend, trying to analyze and figure out Sammy. So same narrative perspective. Right.
You have made it explicit. That's what I was driving at, but you have
clarified it. Yeah.
Very good. And the action is quickly told. It's basically Sammy doing all he can to get ahead. He takes no prisoners. He kicks off his checkered career by basically stealing a short story or some kind of treatment from what is described as this nebbish. Nebbish in Yiddish is just this sort of ineffectual guy that, he just fades into the woodwork in a group of people.
He's like a non in your LA Kid. You called people who didn't play sports at your school nons. Right.
They don't really exist. They're not on the social radar of the people who really count, right? Yeah. So this poor Julian Bloomberg, this nebbish, he's actually very smart, and he's good with words. And early on in the novel, he composes this treatment or story or screenplay, something like along those lines, that he comes to Sammy with, because Sammy has established himself, at the age of 19, 20, as one of the journalists on the paper, from errand boy to journalist in a couple of years. And Julian comes to him with his little story, and he says, I'd like you to help me if you can, Mr. Glick. And Sammy goes, oh yeah, sure, kid, anything for you, right? What he eventually does, he gets on the phone to David L. Selznick. They use the real name. Bud does, Bud Schulberg, the author. He gets on the phone to him, he sells the story for $10,000 for a movie. And of course, he forgets all about Julian. The film eventually is made. Sammy goes out to Hollywood, and not only does Sammy take the money and run, but he gets all the credit. There's not even a mention as co-authored by Julian Bloomberg. So this is like the first big backstab we see Sammy undertake, and very successfully. And it just goes on from there. I mean, he's just merciless. Yeah. He's just stealing stuff. He's stabbing people in the back. He's letting them eat his dust. He doesn't care. He just wants to get ahead. He's looking out for number one.
With all due respect, doesn't he get I think you have omitted, probably intentionally, the fact that he got ahead earlier than that, even by finishing Al Mannheim's story for him and getting his own column as a radio. That's a smaller thing.
Yeah, right. Well, good that you mentioned it. Right. That came before. No, I wanted to get Sammy out to Hollywood.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. You were talking about the big thing he did to get into Hollywood, but there were a couple little other connivings he did as an errand boy before he got there even.
Right. he was warming up for the big kill.
He was doing a couple warm-up jobs.
Newspaper, right? And it just goes from there. I mean, we don't have to go into the details. We can go into certain passages where we, help to exhibit what I think is Schulberg's very fine writing. And he published this at the age of 27. It's hard to imagine. It's like Gatsby being published by Fitzgerald when he wasn't even 30. It's like, geez, it's mind-blowing, because I think the writing is superb. I don't know what you think. You're nodding your head, but I just think it's crisp and dynamic, and has lots of pizzazz.
Well, I'm just nodding my head because I'm showing that I understand what you're saying. It doesn't always mean I agree.
Yeah, that's why I ask.
Yeah, good question. I did not think of the comparison to Gatsby until you mentioned it. I do think but I did see, come to think of it, that Kit character did seem a bit like Jordan Baker. I may have thought of that at least, but I didn't think of the rest of it as being a Gatsby-esque thing until you mentioned it. As for the writing style, it is a kind of a crisp prose that moves forward. It moves forward just like Sammy does. It keeps on
very good.
It keeps on going. Yeah.
As fast-paced as Sammy Glick and his comet-like rise to the top.
Yes.
And the other thing about the novel, I would argue, we'll give you guys some samples of the writing here in a second, but it's got beautiful structure. It really does. That's what Bud, I should think, learned in Hollywood, because unlike novels, which can kind of be these invertebrate, sprawling things, Hollywood, you gotta go from one scene to the next on a straight line. You gotta bring us home inside of an hour and a half or an hour and 50 minutes. And he's got that, Bud, I would argue. He's very good there. And the whole thing just, it climaxes like a Hollywood film too, with great symmetry. We'll get into that perhaps later, how it all ends. But he's got great style, Schulberg, and he's got great structure in this novel. In contrast to the two other Hollywood novels, or LA novels / Hollywood in the case of West, but LA novel of John Fante. In contrast to those two novels, Ask the Dust by Fante and Day of the Locust by Nathaniel West, they're very kind of mushy. They're very kind of, they're not driven. They don't have that Kane drive. And there's much good writing there, but it doesn't have the crispness that I think Schulberg does. It doesn't have the wit that I think Schulberg also brings to bear in the dialogue. There's a lot of clever repartee, which I'm partial to. You may think it's kind of cheap, but I like it. I'm an LA kid. And the great screenplay writer, William Goldman, I don't know if that name rings a bell, but
yes.
He wrote the screenplays to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is perhaps his most famous one. All the President's Men, Marathon Man, to name a few. And he wrote a great book called Inside the Screen Trade. And his big thesis is that as a screenplay writer in Hollywood, there are two dicta that you must always keep in mind, two rules, as it were. The first is structure. This isn't a novel. This isn't even a short story. You got to have structure, right? For a screenplay, for it to fly on the screen. And his other dictum is, in Hollywood, nobody knows anything. Nobody knows what makes a good film, right? Nobody knows the formula. You have things coming out of left field, they're big successes, and why? We just don't know. We try to repeat the formula, it's a flop, right? So those were Goldman's two rules. He's deceased now. Structure and nobody knows anything. And I think Schulberg does a good job of describing those two dicta. How Hollywood is just this anarchic place, dog eat dog, so perfect for Sammy Glick because that's his modus operandi, and the structure you need, right, to actually pull off a story like this. Okay, so just a little sidelight on that. But the one thing I do like about this novel, and why I think it's the great Hollywood novel, there's so much really juicy insider stuff, right? For example, I'll read you something. And just a short little paragraph. It's when Al Mannheim, he's in and out of the Hollywood system. You know, he gets a job, he gets fired, gets another job, gets laid off from that. At one point, he goes back to New York, and he goes to see, he goes to see a film, and he hangs with people that he used to work with, is what it is. I mean, I was able to look at a guy without wondering whether he was a 5 or a 7,500 man, what a screenplay writer might make in Hollywood per week. And I could sit back in a movie and enjoy my 55-cent dream without torturing myself with the knowledge that the best scene in the picture had gone the way of all censors, or that the writing, which was credited to a famous Broadway playwright because he had a sole screenplay credit clause in his contract, was really the work of half a dozen busy little B writers. Here's another one that might be elucidating. It's, he says, for the next couple of hours, we sat in the study batting the story back and forth. So Sammy has employed Al to be sort of a ghostwriter for him for his screenplays. And this is what Sammy does better than anyone. He gets someone else to write the stuff, then he takes the credit for it. But the other guy will get a little bit of money to keep his mouth shut. Okay, so that's Sammy's MO. For the next couple of hours, we sat in the study batting the story back and forth. Sammy's mind drew a blank when it came to originality. But since the same goes for most screen stories, he actually turned this to advantage. What he had was a good memory and a glib way of using it. Our story was like so many others that he could lift ready-made situations from the shelves in the back of his mind, dust them off, and insert them into our yarn like standard automobile parts. So the movie industry. Mix and match, refurbish, put back together, put out on the assembly line, and you get a new product.
It's a lot of inside baseball kind of information that he gives, definitely.
Yeah. And even in the description of Sammy Glick, for example, you got on page, you don't need the page, you're not following along. But he analyzes Sammy Glick and why he was so successful in Hollywood. And here's a short paragraph. First of all, he had no qualms, not the thinnest sliver of misgiving about the value of his work. He was able to feel that the most important job in the world was putting over Monsoon. That's a movie that Sammy wants to get made. In the second place, he was as uninhibited as a performing seal. He never questioned his right to monopolize conversation or his ability to do it entertainingly. And then there was his colossal lack of perspective. This was one of his most valuable gifts, for perspective doesn't always pay. It can slow you down. I have sat in my office and said to myself, there are 12 million of your fellow Americans unemployed this morning. This is in the depths of the Depression. Who the hell are you? If that kept me from writing a line all morning, it might mean I had perspective. Or thinking how the world was 50 million years ago and all the men who had their chance at living in it, and what that had to do with the big payoff scene in Nick Turner, Boy Detective. I was supposed to turn in by 5 o'clock. That's perspective too. Or just staring up into millions of stars at night till you become molecular. Perspective is a fine thing. It can make you very unhappy. I couldn't imagine Sammy ever unhappy, or happy either. I wondered what emotions he did have. Perhaps only a burning impatience to be further on. So you get a little cross-pollination between the descriptions of Sammy and the Hollywood apparatus and procedure.
So, the rise of Sammy and how he kind of just steps on everybody to get to where he wanted reminded me a lot of the career of Richard Wagner.
The great musical anti-Semite.
Ironically so, because Wagner, you always hear this in reading of his biography. He would step on whoever he needed to get his way. Meyerbeer in Paris, Wesendonck, and taking the guy's wife and taking the money to make his next opera. And Sammy's a very Wagnerian character, in my opinion.
Yeah, and as one can still admire Wagner in a way, not just his music, put that aside, but just this ambition and drive to succeed come what may. Steal the wife of your best conductor, and he still kowtows to you and wants to do your pieces.
Hans von Bülow did the world. Hans von Bülow conducted the world premiere of Die Meistersinger and Tristan und Isolde, and Wagner showed his gratitude by stealing his wife.
Yeah. I mean, you don't know whether to pity Bülow for being such an abject character or admire him for being able to put these personal feelings aside. I mean, you're riven.
We need Kevin, we need to make a German version of this novel called What Makes Richard Run. I might write that.
Wieso läuft Richard?
I've already written my master's thesis on a Wagnerian theme. Maybe I'd be primed to write What Makes Richard Run.
Right. But let's stick with that idea. That's an interesting one. That, yes, there is a strange sort of, at least for me, although he's a first-class jerk.
Or heel.
Or heel, yeah, the term that you would use at the time, right? Very good. There's a certain admiration I felt swelling up in me for him. Truly, there's kind of this roguish quality to him that I think just as an American, we have that in us. It's like, yeah, come what may, Vince Lombardi, winning's not everything, it's the only thing. We have a little bit of that in us, I think. And I think Schulberg has tapped into that. He pretends in the introduction that he wanted to write this as a condemnation of such characters. But I think even he, at least through the eyes of his narrator, Al Mannheim, there is more than a grudging admiration that comes across. In fact, this Al Mannheim is often using the term fascinating. He's a fascinating character, this Sammy. And he is. He's sort of the American, really. The anti-Horatio Alger story. Not a guy who comes up through the ranks, through hard work and industry and honest effort. No. Everything but hard working, yes. But all in the cause of the con, right? The con, the gimmick, the angle, right? So, and I'm smiling a little bit as I'm describing this because there's a certain admiration that we as Americans sort of have for that character, and I think that would explain even the success of the book, which it had right off the bat, and still to this day, it's now in the modern library.
Well, Kev, in the afterword, I think it was where Schulberg wrote the afterword. He said that he wrote it kind of as a cautionary tale, but by the 70s and 80s, it became a how-to manual.
And I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so what can I say?
I was thinking of you a bit when I was seeing the rise of Sammy, because you have this driving ambition to be a great writer, and you're realizing it before our very eyes. Now, I don't know if you've done anything unethical to get to where you are or where you want to go. Maybe not, but
No, I haven't.
I do see the same drive and ambition in you that is in Sammy.
Yeah, but it takes a lot of guts to be, such an amoral jerk about it. I mean, I think generally speaking, I've been a very, I've walked the straight and narrow most of my life. I can't think of anything that I've done that has been underhanded or hurtful to anyone else or have betrayed anyone else's trust or loyalty to get ahead. And I haven't gotten that much ahead anyway, but yeah, sure. I have a certain drive to write my books and get them out and become a better writer. But that's why I admire a character like Sammy. He wants more. he wants success. As I said, with those dollar signs in the S's, those dollar signs as S's, and he is good at it. And even in, I mean, it just, what can I say? You wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Doesn't Sammy lose at the end though? Kind of. He marries this girl who he thinks is his trophy bride, and she ends up immediately betraying him, and now he's going to be in a purgatory of this marriage for the rest of his years.
Yeah, that's why I said at the end of our last podcast, I said this is a novel not about the losers, as West writes about, of Hollywood. This is about the winners as the losers, and Sammy Glick as the winner, emblematic for all the others who are like him in Hollywood, who, I guess Bud Schulberg is would like us to believe are not happy. They are not actually achieving their dreams. They're foiling their dreams of happiness, if that's what your dream entails. But the thing is that it's pretty clear that Sammy doesn't care about happiness. He doesn't really care about happiness. He doesn't care about contentment, about satisfaction. He'll never be content. He'll never be satisfied. He'll always be running. And we even leave him at the end after this marriage. It's the Hollywood marriage of the decade, and Sammy has now become the one of a major producer in his studio. He doesn't necessarily backstab the older fellow who had brought him along, but he kind of shuffles him off stage right, and takes his place. And he does this by wooing, or attempting to woo, the beautiful golden girl daughter of a fellow named Harrington. He's a Wall Street banker, and he represents Worldwide Pictures, which is the name of the fictional studio that Sammy and Al work for. And he's one of the Wall Street financiers. And this other fellow, his name is Sidney Feynman. He's the older head of the studio, and he has turned out a couple flops recently. And so the financiers from Wall Street, they want to move him out. And Sammy decides to execute the grand coup of not only becoming head, I don't know if it's head of the studio, but he's head of a production unit at the studio. I'm not entirely clear on that because he's only 30 years old. I don't think they're making him head of the studio. I think I misspoke. But he's got a very he takes Sidney Feynman's slot. And at the same time, he marries this beautiful, probably what would be termed from a Jewish perspective, the unattainable shiksa of his dreams. Let's put it that way. And he marries Lorette Harrington, and he has the biggest wedding, to cap the whole thing off. And then the very night of the wedding, he finds Lorette in the bedroom with one of Sammy's, one of the actors at his studio. So the idea is that Lorette is not taking Sammy seriously as marriage material. She's using him as a means to an end for her father, sort of her father's cat's paw, to solidify the Harrington fortunes. Because Sammy's, he's an up and comer. He's a mover and shaker. He's a macher, right? And they know that. For all we know, maybe they're wasps who hate Jews. We don't know, right? It's just, and Sammy doesn't even care. He just wants this to be the cherry on top of his career cake. But it turns out Lorette doesn't take him seriously, and at that point, he's devastated. For the first time in his life, we note that Sammy has a heart, right? Buried good and deep, but he has one, and it's broken, and he calls Al to come and console him. Lorette has left the house. He's got this big house, Gatsby-esque. It's like a castle. It's described that way. It's like Gatsby's Norman Castle. And he's turned all the lights on, exactly like that scene in Gatsby where he turns all the lights on, and then Nick comes to see him after this episode, the shattering episode for Gatsby in New York, where Daisy rejects him, and then Myrtle Wilson is killed along the way and everything else. And he's in his castle, his Norman replica castle, turning on lights to see into some of his rooms that he hasn't really visited, right? Well, this is the same thing. He turns on all the lights because he doesn't want to be alone in the dark. That's his reason. And then Al comes and he tells Al the story of Lorette, how he caught her in bed with this actor, and how she made it very clear this is just a business arrangement. Whereas Sammy was in love. Maybe he was only in love with the idea of capturing the Golden Girl, the daughter of this Wall Street banker with whom he is now in a partnership, as it were, as head of a production unit at the studio, or head of the studio itself. So even if Sammy's only in love with the idea of being in love with this woman and the idea of his having achieved, the summit of love and his career ambitions, his heart is broken. And then we leave him there in the final scene where he's trying to recover from it. And he calls his valet, this guy named Sheik Dugan, and he says, "Hey, Sheik, hey, come on, get some girls over here, huh? Yeah, we'll get some champagne, get some girls." He's trying to snap out of it. He's trying to get back to his usual modus operandi. And Sammy's back to running again. He'll never stop. He'll never be satisfied. And as you say, he's in a worse place than he ever has been before. He's in this loveless marriage, and his heart is broken, and he's probably more cynical than ever. And we don't want to read the sequel. It's going to be ugly.
Can you read the last paragraph or so of how that ends that you've already described, but I'd like to hear how it actually sounds.
Yeah. It's very Gatsby-esque again, because you have reflections on the part of Al about Sammy and how he fits into the whole American dream. It's like Nick. I have Gatsby here too. It's like Nick going out in the final pages. You'll hear the reverberations. It's like Nick before he moves back to the Midwest. On the last night, with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at that huge, incoherent failure of a house once more. And then he wanders around a bit, and he says, most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy, moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, The inessential houses began to melt away until I gradually became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams for a transitory, enchanted moment. Man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. And as I sat there brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow, we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And then we read Mr. Schulberg's final thoughts on Sammy Glick and America.
All righty.
I thought of all the things I might have told him as he's leaving the house. You never had the first idea of give and take, the social intercourse. It had to be all you, all the way. You had to make individualism the most frightening ism of all. He's speaking to Sammy, as it were, although Sammy's not present. You act as if the world is just a blindfold free-for-all. Only the first time you get it in the belly, you holler brotherhood. But you can't have your brothers and eat them too. You're alone, pal, all alone. That's the way you wanted it. That's the way you learned it. Sing it, Sammy. Sing it deep and sad. All alone and feeling blue. All alone in crowded theaters, company conventions. All alone with 20 of Gladys's girls tying themselves into lewd knots for you. All alone in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, with power and with Harringtons, till death parts you from your only friend, your worst enemy, yourself. But what good are words when not even experience will regenerate? It was too late to hate him or change him. Sammy's will had stiffened. It had been free for an instant at birth, poised bird-free in the doctor's hand that moment in the beginning before it began to be formed to the life molds, the terrible hungers of body and brain, the imposed wants, the traditional oppressions and persecutions, until at last Sammy's will had curled in on itself like an ingrown hair, festering, spreading infection. Now Sammy's career meteored through my mind in all its destructive brilliance, his blitzkrieg against his fellow men. My mind skipped from conquest to conquest like the scrapbook on his exploits I had been keeping ever since that memorable birthday party at the Algonquin. It was a terrifying and wonderful document, the record of where Sammy run. And if you looked behind the picture and between the lines, you might even discover what made him run. And someday I would like to see it published as a blueprint of a way of life that was paying dividends in America in the first half of the 20th century. I find certain reverberations with Gatsby in there.
Yeah.
But again, it's the anti-Gatsby, it's the anti-Horatio Alger. There's no idealism involved in it at all. There's no platonic ideal with Sammy. It's all Sammy. Just go and get it, and devil take the hindmost. So,
thank you, Kev. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to cover two more aspects of the novel that we haven't discussed. I did feel it kind of dragged toward the center section toward the middle section when it talked all about the Union Screenwriters Guild. They got into all the union meetings and controversies and debates about the socialistic screenwriters trying to make a union. I felt it dragged a bit there. What do you think?
I agree with you 100%. And I've read it a couple times before. Every time I read it, I felt that. And I thought, well, the third time around, I won't feel it so much. And I didn't so much because I'm older. I understand the problems of getting a fair wage and how you might have to organize to get a fair wage, and individualism has its limits. But from an aesthetic point of view, I agree with you, it drags. He goes into it too long. I think a chapter on that might have been good to show how Sammy worked the whole movement for the Screenwriters Guild, which I think was established in 1933, to his own advantage. And he goes on and on about that. You know, Bud Schulberg was in the Communist Party for a while. I don't know if you read that in any.
I did, in the Wikipedia. Yeah.
Yeah. He was in the Communist Party, and he wrote the novel. And there was some fellow, I think his name was Lawson, who was the head of the Hollywood chapter of the American Communist Party. And he said, "Look, Bud, you're going to have to make this more pro-communist." And Bud said, "No, this is my book, baby. You know, the commies aren't going to tell me. You know, I might be a member of the party, but you're not going to tell me how to write my books." And he quit. And then later on, that came to haunt him in the HUAC hearings, House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, where, you know, the witch hunt, as it's often called. And Bud, at that point, he said, "I'll name names." These jerks wanted me to change my great novel. Are you crazy? I'll name names, no problem. You know, the commies are a problem, and these guys were a real thorn in my side way back when. So he had no problem naming names. And I agree with him. Yeah, they're going to do that to you. They're going to mess with your art. They deserve everything they get. So I like Bud for that reason. And so he was probably influenced by the fact that he was a sympathizer with the socialism, that he put so much in there. But it was an issue, and it did illustrate. It was an issue at the time in the 30s, where the action in this novel takes place. And it does illustrate what a backstabber Sammy was, you know. Bud was also fighting a lot of cultural influence. His mother apparently was a diehard socialist, knew Trotsky, that kind of stuff.
You said it showed him as a backstabber in those union meetings. How did he backstab in those union meetings?
Well, he went along with it for a while. He was a member of the Committee of Five, as you recall. And these were the guys who were, you know, going, yeah, you know, power to the union and power to the people, all this kind of thing. Then at a certain point, he said, no. You know, he kind of snuck out of it and made his peace with the studio and signed some kind of long-term contract. They only wanted it for 2 years, so they wouldn't be beholden. The union only wanted people to sign contracts for 2 years, so they wouldn't be beholden beyond that, and they could really go on strike then, you know, as a very powerful unit. And in fact, this poor nebbish, Julian Bloomberg, who has followed Sammy to Hollywood after he stole his original treatment for a film, sold to David L. Selznick, Julian follows him to Hollywood and, you know, pleads to him, you know, can you please, you know, give me some credit, give me some money for what you stole from me. And Sammy very imperiously says, yeah, well, I'll help you out, kid. And, you know, again, he uses him as a ghostwriter, puts his own name to his material. But Julian has established himself because he's such a good writer in the meantime. And he actually, he goes the whole 9 yards with the union. And so he's blackballed from the studios after, because the union apparently folds at a certain point. And so he's out in the cold again. So, yeah, you have this nice contrast between this man of integrity, this Julian Bloomberg, who, even though he really needs the money, needs the work, he said, yeah, but I'm for solidarity here. And he falls on his sword, as it were. And Sammy goes waltzing off into the sunset to do his own thing and forge his career further. So yeah, but it's unnecessary. I think if Bud had another crack at it, he would maybe agree with you and cut it by a couple chapters. It goes on too long.
He does go on quite a bit. Now, one more aspect I'd like to talk about before we finish up here. I think my favorite part of the novel was where Al Mannheim, later in the novel, goes back to the Lower East Side to go to where Sammy was born and was raised. And you mentioned the mother of, yeah.
Yeah, very good timing, because this is the book's punchline, right? What makes Sammy run? Well, here's the answer. Maybe you want to tell us.
He grew up in an oppressive atmosphere towards Jewish people, getting beat up by this guy, calling him a Christ killer. He saw all these boys trying to get ahead in this difficult, impoverished circumstances. He wants to impress his mother, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But it basically shows that he was conditioned by his environment as a young man. The nature versus nurture kind of debate.
Right. And he wants to escape his past. He wants to kill the father in the Freudian sense, because he felt his father was a loser. And his father was a union man, right? So that's also a reason why Sammy can never be a union man. It's his loser father who fell prey to that and led a very impoverished existence. So Sammy is out to avenge his feeling of inferiority, not only as a Jew, but as a poor Jew and as a young man growing up in I guess the Lower East Side at that time. Rivington Street, I think, is mentioned. It was a real ghetto. So Jew, Irishman, Italian, anyone can understand that. You don't want to stick around there. So it's not just
that passage, that whole passage of going back there to see where he grew up and what conditions he grew up in. It reminded me of the movie Once Upon a Time in America by Sergio Leone. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
It reminded me of that same Jewish milieu, which Leone lays out in beautiful cinematographic terms. I had that image in my head as I was reading that passage from Schulberg.
Yeah. And it's a nice technique. Schulberg uses throughout. He doesn't always take us into a certain scene chronologically in a linear fashion. He will meet with Sammy, and then Sammy will start telling him something. Then he'll go to an italicized 3 pages where the scene is just reenacted without Sammy sitting there with all these quotation marks cluttering up the narrative, right? You know what I mean? Yeah. That's nice. And Norman Mailer later picked up on that in The Naked and the Dead, published 1948, what he called the time machine, where he was giving us the linear story of GIs in the South Pacific in World War II. And then he would take a break and he would have something called the time machine. It sounds corny, but yeah, that's what he used. It works. And he would go into an italicized passage, as it were, where it goes into the background of this certain GI. Maybe a Jewish guy from Lower East Side, maybe some tough talking sergeant from Texas, maybe some milquetoast guy from Washington State. Nothing against Washington State, just try to cover every part of the country here. As Baylor did, he showed it was a real multi-ethnic force, this American army that was fielded against the Japanese. And this is the technique that Schulberg uses here, and he uses that in an extended way when Al goes back to New York and then visits Sammy's old stomping grounds as a kid, and meets the mother, meets Israel, the older brother, who's a very pious Jew and frowns upon Sammy. But, and this is what's nice to read, but the mother is still enamored of her Sammy because he sends her money. He doesn't check in. He doesn't say how I'm doing, Ma, but he just send her money, right? So again, the guy has a certain sense of responsibility, and you kind of like him. I got to say, I do kind of like the guy. I just we can maybe end on this one. The way he's described in a couple of passages, it can shed light on not only on the character, Schulberg does a great job of that, but maybe sheds light a little bit on why you can maybe like the guy. That was one thing you had to give Sammy. He made no bones about it, at least with me. He was glorifying the American rat. Yeah, he's a rat, but he makes no bones about it. He's not a hypocrite, right? Or another passage. Let's see.
He's described as having a ferret-like look.
Right. A hungry look, right? A hungry look. He wants more and more and more. I mean, it's cupidity, it's venality, it's avarice, but there's a certain quiet or not so quiet drive behind it, like a dynamo. He's described as a dynamo. And that's always exciting, a certain personality that's throwing off sparks. And here's one where Sammy's described as a fetus. A fetus called Sammy Glick, sprinting out of his mother's womb, turning life into a race in which the only rules are fight for the rail and elbow on the turns, and the only finish is death. Or this is where Kit, this Jordan Baker-like character, is speculating on Sammy. Well, you know how the id is supposed to be the core of your basic appetites, which the superego dresses in the clothes of respectability to present to the outside world. Somehow Sammy never had time to get dressed up the way all those others have. He was the thing itself, the id, out in the open. It might not be very pretty, but there it was. And maybe one last one. When he was knifing his fellow man in the back, he performed with such gusto and brilliance that it fascinated me as a tour de force. He was so conscientious about being unscrupulous that you almost had to admire him. And that's my feeling. You don't admire him wholeheartedly, but if you take into account his Lower East Side origins and the rough and tumble world he grew up in, he's in this world that he didn't create, at least as far as he's concerned. And he's not going to be a victim. He's going to be a top dog if it kills him, if it kills others. But he has been, as you say, socialized. And I was going to end there, but I'll say one last thing. And this is a little bit tedious sometimes when Bud Schulberg goes sociology 101 on us, right? We can kind of put two and two together. You don't have to spell it out, Bud. But it's also not of interest, not uninteresting to spell it out, because our listeners only have an hour here. And I'm sorry to take so long. I had it there for a second and then I lost it. Okay, I got it now. This is what he says. This is sort of the moral of the tale, right? From Bud Schulberg, good socialist, member of the Communist Party at the time he was writing this, before he then left it. Okay, I said, this is Al Mannheim speaking. When Sammy Glick first walked into my office, he turned my stomach. But just think if when he walked in, I'd known as much about him as I do now. And this is after he visits the mother and gets Sammy's story basically from his older brother, Israel. We only hate the results of people. But people aren't just results. They're a process. And to really give them a break, we have to judge the process through which they became the result we see when we say so-and-so is a heel. Now, the world is full of people hating other people's guts. Okay. Now, answer me this. What if each of them took the time to go down to Rivington Street? I mean, each person's particular Rivington Street. We would begin to have compassion in the world. That's what. He's at a bar. He's talking to the bartender. He's a little bit drunk, so it gets a little bit maudlin. But that's basically the message. At the same time as Bud Schulberg, on the other hand, is condemning this behavior. He's not at all approving of it. Not at all. He said so in the introduction, so I have to believe him.
One final thing I'd like to mention, the kid who beat him up all the time in the schoolyard and called him Christ killer and other kinds of derogatory.
Sheik Dugan.
he becomes Sammy's right-hand man in adulthood because for some psychological reason, this is Sammy's victory over that kind of anti-Semitism and prejudice.
Yeah, he says valet.
And you said he got the shiksa, meaning the Gentile girl at the end as well. So you start understanding.
Laurette Harrington. And yeah, that is also mentioned that he wanted her because she humiliated him on a couple of occasions.
There you go.
That's described. She humiliated him. She looked down upon him. And as we see, even after the marriage, she still looks down on him.
So there's kind of a Nietzschean, that which does not destroy me makes me stronger element here. A very social Darwinist kind of theme going throughout.
Yeah, and that's what maybe I like about him.
But we need to really wrap it up. So
I will wrap it up by saying this. That's maybe what I like about him, the fact that he has this quality that Americans always admire. He has comeback, right? He can take it on the chin, and you can't keep him down. He has this unstoppable energy and ambition, and even if it's misdirected, it throws off a lot of sparks. Okay. And that denotes a certain charisma, and why people like Al Mannheim and Catherine Kitt Sargent, although they are very critical of him, they are still drawn to him.
Okay. All right, Kevin, I think you gave a good account of the book. You think it's a great Hollywood novel? I'm not sure because I don't know enough Hollywood novels to say, but it certainly is part of the pantheon of Hollywood works. Most definitely. Literary works. All right, Kev. So we better finish up. We're going quite over time here. I think it was worth it, though, because there was a lot to examine in this novel. But any final word before I say farewell?
Well, it's a great Hollywood novel, and it's also, I think it's a Jewish novel. I mean, in the introduction to the book that you and I both have of What Makes Sammy Run, Bud Schulberg does say that he was careful to make a great many of the characters Jewish, right? Julian Bloomberg, Al Mannheim, Sammy Glick, obviously Jewish, but then the people that he victimizes, Schulberg wanted to also make Jewish so that the book wouldn't be accused of anti-Semitism. Now, how can a Jew be anti-Semitic? Okay, well, whatever, Jewish self-hatred, they speak of that all the time. Okay, good, I guess you can be, but he didn't want to even invite that criticism. But he still got it. He still got it, that it was anti-Semitic. But he said, look, I'm making all the victims Jewish. But I think this is really a Jewish book because it is, I think the Jews more than anyone have bought into this notion of inventing yourself anew in America and then going out to Hollywood and reinventing yourself. And in fact, there's a great book by Neil Gabler, Gabler. It's called An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood. It's a great book. I recommend it to everyone. And the Jews not only invented Hollywood, but they also invented themselves at the same time. And I think the American story of invention and reinvention, and then, most of the Jews came from the East Coast, the big cities, the immigrant Jews in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then going on to Hollywood and creating this empire of their own, that's a very Jewish story. So the Hollywood story, at least in its early decades, is perforce a Jewish one. It was a Jewish-dominated industry. They were the ones who, made the films, got the distribution out, owned the theaters, and that's why I say it's a Jewish story. So not anti-Semitic, but it's Jewish. I would argue.
I believe he was trying to, as it mentioned in the foreword, he was trying to show the full spectrum of Jewish life, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it.
Right.
Bring back a Sergio Leone reference there.
Yeah. You got Sammy Glick, who maybe Hitler would enjoy, right? Because he's a bad Jew, right? Although I admire him again. Al Mannheim, who's sort of a nice guy Jew. Like you have nice guy whatever's right, exactly. Julian Bloomberg, the nebbish, the nerd. You got Sidney Feynman, the grand old man who gets toppled. He did a good job of that, right? And so there are no Jewish caricatures here. I think that's what he wanted to avoid, and I think he avoided it quite well. Yeah.
All right. So we went about 10 minutes over time, but I think there was enough important stuff to bring up that it merits. Yeah. All right, Kev, but I really
if you read one novel about Hollywood / Los Angeles, what makes Sammy run?
All right, Kevin.
All right.
I think you've made a good case for that. And we will see you next week talking about Less Than Zero by Bret Easton Ellis, okay?
Very good. See you then.
All right. Good.